First we have Max Anders on the theist side. Max is a philosophy graduate assistant for David Beck at Liberty University. He has BS in religion with a specialization in biblical studies and is finishing his MA in philosophical studies with a specialization in the philosophy of religion. His scholarly work includes 2 review articles on Molinism and divine providence, as well as 2 articles currently in the review process. One is co-authored with David Beck on God and the multiverse, and the second is on Einstein's theory of relativity and its impact on theology. Max has lectured on logic, the various arguments for the existence of God, the multiverse, the problem of evil, and more. His master's thesis is on fine-tuning argument in light of the multiverse. He will be starting his PhD in the philosophy of science and physics next spring. He and his wife, Leah, currently live in Forest, Virginia. And joining Max, Josh Nixon. Josh is a, or is it Joshua? Joshua. Joshua is an international studies major from Culpeper, Virginia. He is a member of NLCF, which is... Gotcha. Joshua is a member of the Virginia Tech Interfaith Initiative, a fellow with Ask Big Questions at BT, and is studying Spanish and Arabic. Lovely to have both of you gentlemen here. And in this corner, we have, first of all, Dan Linford. Dan is presently a PhD student at Virginia Tech in physics, but is soon to join the philosophy department. I tried to warn them, but they accepted it anyway. Originally from upstate New York, Dan did his undergraduate studies at the University of Rochester. He runs the blog Liberare Cogitare e Ratio, and is a member of Free Thinkers at Virginia Tech. He has lectured on secular meaning of life, arguments about the existence of God, ideological competition, and his research in, and also lectured on his research in non-equilibrium statistical physics. That old thing. And joining Dan is Beau Bradley. Beau is an undergraduate biology major at Virginia Tech. He is a junior who is 25 years old, and before transferring to Virginia Tech from Northern Virginia Community College, was enlisted as a French linguist in the United States Army. Now, before we begin, how we'll proceed, I guess, is we'll have each member of the panel give about a 20-minute statement, and that will be followed by a question and answer period. But I was also asked to query, does everyone have one of the handouts from the theist side? If one is in need of a handout, I suppose they're around somewhere. Okay. I guess we were pretty need one. Also, before we begin, I'd like to give a few words of thanks to those who have made this event possible. The Leopard Zeus Fan Club, Free Thinkers at Virginia Tech, Liberty University Philosophy Department, Ask Big Questions at Virginia Tech, and all of you fine people who are attending. Also, I was asked to ask you about filling the questionnaires that were handed out the door. Please do so. I guess that would be very useful to various members of the board. And finally, this may betray some neutrality, but I was also asked to declare that there is a table with Richard Dawkins Foundation merchandise available downstairs. Okay. So with that, let's begin with our first speaker, Max.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in a discussion of one of the most important questions one could ever ask. My wife and I have always been impressed with this university. It's just a pleasure to be here. This evening we will be defending the proposition God probably exists. We will present three different arguments for this case. To defend our case, we will be using the prime principle of confirmation, which is whenever we are considering two competing hypotheses, an observation counts as evidence in favor of the hypothesis under which the observation has the highest probability. This principle is sound under all interpretations of probability. This principle, each argument must be taken on its own grounds, and admittedly, one cannot arrive at God at the end of each argument. A cumulative case, a conjunction of the arguments at the end, is what will get us to the conclusion that God probably exists. The first argument is the Thomistic cosmological argument. This traces back to Plato and Aristotle, and here as developed by Thomas Aquinas. Premise 1. What we observe and experience in our universe is contingent. 2. A network of causally dependent contingent things cannot be infinite. Premise 3. A network of causally dependent contingent things must be finite. Therefore, there must be a first cause in the network of contingent causes. In this context, what I mean by contingent is that if X is contingent, then X owes its existence to something else. For a thing that has the potentiality of movement cannot actualize its own potential. Some other thing must cause it to move. The universe consists of a network of causes. A was caused by B, but only because B was caused by C, and so on. We know of nothing that spontaneously initiates its own causal activity. Even supposed quantum indeterminacy requires antecedent conditions or causal state of affairs for the event to occur, such as the governance of the laws of nature. This is a hierarchical or a transitive network of causation. This is not temporal. Note that nothing here turns on our having to know about everything. Additionally, this argument stands completely independent of any principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason was later added by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Samuel Clarke to use the first premise as a universal claim. That's not the case here. It's inapplicable. Concerning premise 2, this network of contingent causes cannot go on into infinity. In such a series, the indeterminate causes have no power of their own, but are mere effects of their preceding causes. It doesn't matter whether there is an actual infinite set of contingencies, because such a set could not move from potentiality to actuality on its own accord. For instance, a train with an infinite set of boxcars cannot move without a locomotive. Also, consider David Hume's objection, stating that you can never get an infinite cause from a finite effect. Hume argued that if you could explain the subsets, or the boxcars, then you can explain the whole infinite set, the whole train. Paul Edwards follows Hume along similar lines. Edwards argues that each one in the series fully explains the one it depends on. However, in explaining the first member of a set, one must go outside of the set in order to have an explanation for it. An infinite series never gets out of the set. Thomas is willing to grant an infinite set of causes in fieri, or in process, but not in S causation, essence or being. That cannot be infinite. Premise 3 is the logical conclusion from premise 2. Thus, the reason that any contingent thing exists at all, and in particular the world of which we are a part, is that it is a contingent causal consequence of an absolutely necessary being, a being which itself could not have failed to exist. Only two things are possible explanations: abstract objects or minds. However, abstract Platonic objects stand in no causal capacities. The only option remaining is a mind. By implication, we remain with an uncaused cause, which must be spaceless, timeless, and transcendent. Thus, to ask the question, what caused the first uncaused cause, is nonsensical. Second argument is the fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument argues that when the physics and the laws of nature are expressed mathematically, their values are ever so balanced in a way that permits the existence of life. This claim is made on the basis that the existence of vital substances such as carbon, the properties of the objects such as stable, long-lived stars, depend rather sensitively on the values of these physical parameters and the cosmological conditions. I'm merely arguing that the universe, or multiverse, is finely tuned for the essential building blocks and environments life requires for cosmic and biological evolution to even occur. Premise 1. Given the fine-tuning evidence, a life-permitting universe, or multiverse, is very, very epistemically unlikely under the non-existence of a fine-tuner. 2. Given the fine-tuning evidence, a life-permitting multiverse, or universe, is not unlikely under the fine-tuner hypothesis. Therefore, the life-permitting multiverse strongly supports a fine-tuner hypothesis over a non-fine-tuner hypothesis. Now, on the handouts, that square is not a necessity modal quantifier. That's supposed to be a much, much less than symbol. Now remember, K prime here represents some appropriately chosen background information that does not include the other arguments for the existence of God. These are taken on independent backgrounds. The argument is valid since the conclusion follows from the premises. So I think that the fine-tuning evidence is very, very unlikely under a non-fine-tuner hypothesis. Well, single universe scenarios require the fine-tuning of the laws of nature, the fundamental constants, the initial conditions of the Big Bang in order for life to exist. The list of necessary parameters is quite extensive, such as the fine-tuning of the strong and weak nuclear forces, the electromagnetic force, the cosmological constant, etc. However, the most common reaction to the fine-tuning argument is to appeal to one of 4 different types of multiverse scenarios, 3 of which of those suggest that our Hubble volume, our universe, is one amongst countless others in the sea of universes with different physics. However, these multiverse scenarios require just as much of an explanation as a single universe. The inflationary superstring multiverse scenario can only produce life-sustaining universes because it has the following 4 components. The first is a mechanism to supply the energy needed to form the bubbles. This is the fine-tuning of the inflation field. The second is a mechanism to form the bubbles. This is Einstein's field equations with a fine-tuning and coupling of the inflation field. The inflation field that gives empty space a positive energy density is needed to achieve these first 2 components. Without either factor, there would neither be regions of space that inflate, nor would those regions have the mass energy necessary for the universe to exist. If, for example, the universe obeyed Newton's theory of gravity instead of Einstein's, the vacuum energy of the inflation field would at best simply create gravitational attraction, not expansion. The third component is a mechanism to convert the energy of the inflation field to the normal mass energy we find in our universe. The conversion of the energy of the inflation field to the normal mass energy of our universe is achieved by Einstein's equivalence of mass and energy, the famous E equals mc squared, along with the assumption that there is a coupling between the inflation field and the matter fields. The fourth mechanism is one that allows enough variation in the constants of physics among the universes. After all, one of the predictions of quantum cosmology is random constants. This mechanism would be superstring theory, or M theory. Although some of the laws of physics can vary from universe to universe in M theory, these fundamental laws and principles underlie M theory and therefore cannot be explained as a product of the multiverse selection. Further, since the variation among universes would consist of variation of the masses and types of particles that form the forces between them, complex structures would almost certainly not be atom-like, and stable energy sources would almost certainly require aggregates of matter. Thus, the said fundamental laws seem necessary for there to be life in many of the universes, not merely in any universe with our specific types of particles and forces. In defense of premise 2, the best scientific evidence does suggest fine-tuning. The fine-tuning hypothesis is a religiously neutral position. The question is whether it is more reasonable to infer the existence of a fine-tuner to produce a product that exhibits fine-tuning, or whether this happened by chance. Andre Linde recently published a paper suggesting that there are 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 7 universes in this multiverse landscape as a product of slow-roll inflation. We know at least one universe that exhibits life that may have been randomly produced, or this could be a product of gnomic necessity. However, there must be a strong case for gnomic necessity. It doesn't seem to be connected with any sense of logical or metaphysical necessity. A case would have to be made. The conclusion follows logically from the premises. This gets us to an extremely intelligent agent. Whether this is one universe or one universe or one amongst the sea of other universes in the multiverse landscape, the fine-tuning evidence must have an explanation. Thus, the evidence of the fine-tuning we observe, the values and constants and laws of nature, the initial conditions, the inflation field, Einstein's equations, and string theory itself is much, much more likely under the hypothesis that there is a fine-tuner. Our third argument is the moral argument. Premise 1. There are objective axiomatic moral facts that obtain. 2. Either the world alone or the world and a perfectly moral person best explain these facts. 3. It is the case that the world and a perfectly moral person best explain these facts. Therefore, the world and a perfectly moral person best explain these facts. In essence, it seems that there are objective moral facts, and this asks the question, what's the best explanation for these facts? Premise 1 assumes moral realism. Some actions really are objectively, morally abhorrent. By objective, I mean that the truth value of such moral facts are true regardless of whether anyone recognizes them to be so or not. For instance, raping and torturing children for pleasure is wrong. The massacre here on campus, which took place nearly 5 years ago, was utterly wicked and evil, a tragedy. Teenage girls being trafficked around the world for sex is abominable. One ought to love others. One ought not to rape and murder. Now, what is the best explanation for these facts? Well, there are two options for the best explanation. The first is the natural world alone. The world can account for certain moral facts, but natural explanations will ultimately be insufficient in explanatory scope and power. It does seem to be the case that the natural order can account for some things due to certain features of this world, such as the intersubjective moral agreement, satisfactions of morality, you feel good when you do good, creatures with cognitive, and affective capacities as ours, rational apprehension of moral truths, creatures with the essential properties we have. The world is metaphysically rich and robust. Human social requirements and or motivation theory get the ball rolling, but it cannot account with complete sufficiency. Attempts to ground such axiomatic facts in socio-biological evolution will ultimately be inefficient. For an axiomatic fact to be objective, it must be true in all possible worlds. The fact must be necessary. If we were to rewind the film of evolution and allow it to play out again, it's certainly possible that natural selection acting on random mutations would create a different biological landscape from what we observe today. Additionally, purely naturalistic theories suffer the is-ought problem. Science can certainly tell us what is the case in the current state of affairs, but it cannot tell us what ought to be the case. Where do obligations come from? Deontology, or duty-based ethics, cannot be accounted for in a purely naturalistic axiology. If ought implies can, and one is naturally determined to act contrary to the ought, how proficient can such a view be in accounting for these facts? Also, attempts to ground deontic ethics in Platonic terms, merely affirms that these facts obtain, but it does not have any explanation or explanation power. In Sam Harris's recent books, The Moral Landscape and Free Will, he has attempted to redefine normative statements. He equates human well-being with the good, and that which does not contribute to the human well-being, not good. In the moral landscape, Harris states, questions about values are really questions about the well-being of conscious creatures. I want to develop a science of human flourishing. The problem here is equating human flourishing with the good. Why is that? Why not the well-being of cats, dogs, or sponges? Such attempts to ground objective axiomatic facts leaves one with speciesism, a bias and special treatment for the Homo sapiens sapiens species, and a suppression of other species. Certainly, science can account for how we come to know certain axiomatic facts, but it cannot account for their grounding. I'm not saying human well-being isn't good, since good categorically encompasses human well-being, but such an account for objective morality does not satisfy the demands of a robust axiology, namely the problem of deontology. Additionally, how could one know what increases the well-being of conscious creatures? This suffers the same problem as utilitarian ethics. Surely it could be the case that something dreadful, awful, and painful could produce something good in the future, especially if this is based on the pains of evolution. The problem is that something bad now may not have a good effect at the present. It may not be viewed as maximizing human well-being, and thus may be considered bad